Welcome to the latest episode of Ed Influence. I'm Nick Mackenzie from Brown Jacobson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by John Murphy, currently CEO of Oasis Community Learning and soon to be working both nationally and internationally to support CEOs and international school systems. Thank you, John, for joining me today. I wanted to start by inviting you to tell me a story from your life that would give me a picture of who you are as a leader.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And maybe this might sort of very quickly reveal who I am and why I'm in the education system. So I know we all have a past, but this story will hopefully demonstrate why I'm passionate about the education system in the UK. So one of my first memories as a child was being in a reception class in a Catholic primary school. And I went out for lunch one day. And just before I went out for lunch, I remember it was a very tall Irish Catholic nun, and forgive my Irish accent, but she said, "Jan Murphy, what's this?" And she pointed to what I now know as a capital H on the wall, and I just froze. I was in front of everybody, I froze, and I just hadn't got a clue what that letter was. And she said, "Well, if you don't know, you better know by the time you come back." And when I came back from lunch that afternoon, she never asked me. So that was my first I felt it was one of my first introductions to reading. And as I went through the school system in the UK, by the age of 7, I could sense that the gap was widening, that other children were more capable than what I was doing. And with my parents' agreement, the primary school I was then in sent me to a special reading centre each afternoon, which the other children in the class unkindly whispered to me that I was getting on the spastics bus. And what I remember is the centre didn't really help me, and I continued to struggle in class. And you'd be in that situation, Nick, where children would whisper to you all the wrong answers, you'd get in trouble. Or what I tried to do is just hide in the classroom. And very early memories for me. By the age I was 10, and it was actually on Silver Jubilee Day. You're probably not old enough to remember this, but I do. And my elder sister, Catherine, was tragically killed in a car accident. And for a number of years, you'll appreciate, large Irish Catholic family, but my family were very much frozen in grief for a long time. In Kent, where I lived, all my brothers and sisters went on and passed the 11 plus, and I failed the 11 plus, and I felt very much trapped in a comprehensive school. I struggled in the bottom sets. And I think one of the things that stays with me, Nick, more than anything else, is that following my sister's death, not a single teacher asked me about my sister's death, and nobody from my memory seemed to see me struggling in the system. I wasn't given additional support, and I just continued to fail. I went on, in those days there weren't GCSEs, there were O-levels. I went on to do my O-levels, and I failed every one of them. And it was finally one of my elder sisters who made a difference for me, teaching me to read, tutoring me. And then my father said, well, the best thing to do is just resit the whole of year 11. So I went down a year with the children I hadn't been particularly kind to in school. And I then was in a situation where I finally got GCSEs, and then I sort of caught up. But for me in my life, right up until recently, I've always felt behind. I felt stupid. I felt not good enough. And what's driven me to be sort of successful in many ways is an unhealthy desire to prove myself. And so I've been driven by not a sense of satisfaction, but actually reverse than that nothing's quite good enough. And so in 2018, whatever I was doing, whether it was being a CEO of Oasis, or whether it was running a number of marathons, or it was getting an next black belt in karate, whatever it may be, nothing gave me a sense of satisfaction. And so a couple of colleagues I work with very closely said, "You never seem happy. Why don't you go and get counselling?" And I was like, "I don't need counselling. Of course I don't need counselling." And what I did is about in 2018, I went and had some counselling. And what it did, it helped me understand where I was actually coming from as a person, that actually I'd had a stone in my shoe, that I'd never felt quite right, never felt good enough. And that counselling was transformational, because now I'm in a situation where I am content with myself, but I didn't understand myself. And one of the things the counsellor said was that what you're doing all the time is giving air to everybody else, but you're suffocating yourself. And I thought that was quite an important metaphor for me in my life at the time, because whatever I did, wasn't good enough. And so you'll probably appreciate from that story that the passion that I've got around education is making sure that children are heard, they're not left behind, and that we create a better society. And education is such an important golden ticket for children, but it's the love, care and attention that they get. And so very much in Oasis, we've really tried to foster a sense of children feeling loved in the development of their character, whilst it's important they have those skills, behaviour, attitude and knowledge. So it's been I feel like the last few years of, as you go through your life, isn't it, you sort of make sense of where you've come from, who you are and what you want to achieve. I've done it retrospectively, Nick, if that's helpful.
Thank you very much, John. I mean, it's quite a story. I was wondering, would you be happy to share a bit more about your sister who intervened at that critical moment for you?
Yeah, I think what had happened was, because my parents were very much dealing with their own grief, and when I'd failed my GCSEs, it was a really clear marker that things weren't going right. Because all my brothers and sisters had gone to university, Durham, Cambridge, etc. They'd been very successful academically. And when I failed the GCSEs, there was a pinch point. Do I go out into the world of work, or do I stay in school? And I think just having my dad, funnily enough, my father was a head teacher. He was the Catholic president of England and Wales. So he was, a big cheese in the education world. But of course, my mum was then looking after 5 children. So it's about time. What time have you got? And it was my sister, I think, who fostered in me a better sense of confidence. But it was that pinch point of failure where there was an intervention. And you see it now, don't you? The GCSE results are coming up and there's a big thing about children failing or passing, as opposed to that sense of education hopefully being able to light a passion in people. Education finding out what you're good at, as opposed to this is the set curriculum, you'll fail or not fail. And even when you get to universities now, the latest data that I've read shows that 37% of young people are in university. And education is dedicated to that. But actually, what about, the 63% of children who aren't at university? How is education helping mould and develop them as people to be happy, to be flourishing? And we use that word. I think that word is being used more and more, particularly post-pandemic mental health, etc. Actually, we want people to be confident and happy. And independent living or sustaining a relationship might be, obviously a really big target for someone.
A moment ago, you talked about your experience in counselling and about you giving oxygen to everybody else, but not yourself. I was curious, what have you discovered in that to give yourself more time?
I think what I've done at times is inhabit the worst traits of leadership. That if it's not done well enough, I need to do things. And I think what it's enabled me to do, hopefully, is be a better leader in the fact that as a CEO and in Oasis Community Learning, we've got 5,000 staff, we've got 32,700 young people, and you depend very much on a really interdependent, strong team of people. And what I've learned to do is learn to conduct and enable and support and lead rather than drive. And I think the whole issue around giving leaders the freedom to lead gives me time back to be much more strategic in what I'm doing. So not having to make the decisions, but developing leaders and really looking about what it means to sustain leadership and develop succession planning, and being very deliberate that you're there to coordinate, to guide, not do it. And I think that's provided a much better opportunity for me ambassadorially within Oasis to develop our profile and the work that we do across 21 local authorities. So, it's an enormous privilege and responsibility.
I wanted to, just for a moment, in terms of people that have perhaps influenced you, John, is thinking of a leader that you've followed personally that's led you. Why did you follow them?
There's two people, I think, in terms of leadership who've had a profound effect on me. The first one is Sir John Rowling, who passed away a couple of years ago. And he, whilst being an outstanding head teacher, he was a leader who I watched very closely. He supported me when I was a principal in Oasis Academy, Coulsdon. And by that time, I was on my 5th headship. And of course, when you get to 5th headship, you think, I know how to do things. It's absolutely fantastic. And when he turned up at Oasis Academy Coulsdon, he did an analysis of our results. He taught me things that I've never seen before. And the more that I worked with him and became a Pixel associate and worked with other schools, he had this amazing fanatical discipline where he would constantly ask questions. It wasn't about him having the answers. He was interested. He was learning all the time. And he was evoking in you a love of learning and what you're doing. And what he did is had an amazing capacity to ask you a question, and then you ended up part of a working party, or you'd be interested, and then you start to facilitate, and you just learn collaboratively of that process. And he was remarkable. And I think the other thing for me was very much my father was a head teacher. And at the time, and we always hear this, he was the youngest head teacher in the UK, but he was 28 when he became a head teacher. And he always taught me that he never gave me any answers. When I was going through my first and second headship, and I asked him questions, he said, "It's all right, son." He said, "You'll work it out for yourself." And, he gave you the confidence to say that you'll do it yourself. But so very much my father as one, and secondly, Sir John Rowling as the former. He was so clear about criticisms at the time of Gove and about the wider education and how education needs to include all. And he kept that. And that's been very much the rallying call of Pixel ever since. What can we do? How can we see the best in every single child, and not to write children off at any stage? Always see the passion for them. I thought he was an amazing person.
Sounds like Clee had an impact. Could you share a bit more about your father? I was interested in that. It must have been really difficult for him as a head teacher in terms of how you described that. What else did you learn from him?
He incredibly humble, incredibly gracious. One of my childhood memories is when he left. He was a head 4 or 5 times, and I was invited to one of his leaving dues when he was working in a primary school in Mitcham. And as he left the school, the parents stood in a long row, and they all spread him with petals as he went, because he was really, really loved. But he was an incredibly gracious, humble person. It was never about him. It was never about making assumptions. He just wanted to do his best. And I think the graciousness that he showed paid off, that people wanted to work for him. And that was very much been the same in his personal life as much as in his professional life in the same way.
Thank you, Joanne. I suppose that image of the community saying goodbye to him there reminds me in terms of about the hub model of Oasis and the fact of being out in the community. What does leadership mean for you when you go beyond the school gates and into a community?
I liken it to Maslow's hierarchy, because on the school gate as a principal, and I wanted to model this with staff every day, that we would do a welcome committee. We'd welcome every child, we'd make sure they're ready for the school day, we'd make sure they have a uniform, we'd check whether they're eaten in the morning. And that's Maslow's hierarchy, that, school should provide a safe place. You should be meeting all their basic needs, allows them to go through that sense of self-actualization when they're in school. But I'm very much aware that when I became a head teacher of an EBD school for boys with emotional and behaviour difficulties, I took over a school in special measures and was asked at very short notice to move from a primary school to a secondary school. And I found out retrospectively the reason they wanted me to do that was because I was semi-professional karate instructor, and I was like the safest choice in the local authority at the time. I was the biggest local, safe person. When I went to the school, it was just an enormous education. I ran my first parents' evening there, and I had one mum from Somalia, Somalian mum, non-English speaking, turn up. I had no one else turn up. I was thinking, this is ridiculous. And then what I did is I visited each one of those children's homes and held the parents' meeting at the child's home, or if the child was in local authority care, for example, in their care home. And it was the biggest education for me before I went to Oasis about actually what it means. I'm white, I come from a middle-class loving background. I've had lots of, opportunities and in some respects over time support. But many of the young men who were coming directly out of Feltham had total, very, very challenging upbringing, huge poverty, gangs, vulnerability, sexual abuse, etc. And they needed a total package of love and support. And that's what we've tried to do through Oasis, through the hub model. making sure that there are food banks availability, making sure that there is debt advice for parents, making sure, for example, we home visit when there are really serious safeguarding. We don't stay away and hope things get better. We get into the community and get involved, because it takes a family to raise a child. You hear that whole, the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that's what we try to do through Oasis in the Hub approach.
And what have you found being the most difficult part of being a leader, John?
I think probably from the story that I've shared with you is having the emotional maturity to be willing to be emotionally vulnerable to gain and seek the support that you need. A lot of leadership journeys are very much based on the hero leader, the hero head, the person who can do everything. And that's what I think I grew up with in my mind's eye about, well, actually, this is what it's like. But actually, when you read the books like, Jim Collins, Good to Great, it's very much about the servant leader and how you support others. But when I very much went through counselling, it was an incredibly painful process. I then learned, instead of saying, I've got the answers, to say, look, I'm really struggling with this, and invite people into that journey of leadership. And for me, that was a game changer. I mean, I was asked to provide a video footage of my own life story. And when I sent that out to staff across Oasis, I had numerous people writing to me saying, thank you, by you being vulnerable, I now feel I can be vulnerable in my own setting. And what it creates is a new sense of a relationship, a connectedness. And in that connectedness, you develop the intimacy to be able to sort through problems and work through problems together.
It's interesting to say that. I was just about to ask you, what did you learn? What did you notice different when you became more vulnerable? Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how that impacted in your relationship around the boardroom or with other senior leaders, because you've obviously covered the wider staff body there.
Yeah, I think that my board in over time have been, and being being open very much in this disclosure, sometimes didn't feel as much involved in the journey of the organisation, because I'd turn up with all the answers. And whatever challenge and support they raised with me, I felt, no, I'm fine, I'm ready, I can do this, it's fine, here's the answer. And actually, when I had that change of focus to say, look, we've got the clear vision, we've got the strategy, we know the outcomes we're going to achieve, but I'm not sure about this strategy. What are your thoughts on it? And when we started to really share the strategic objectives of the organisation in some detail, suddenly you found board members who were, for example, really good in terms of neurodiversity, or board members, for example, we've got an incredible board member called Anne Holt, for example, who's been the diocesan director for Chichester. Suddenly they were posing really, really good questions, and it became much more of a partnership and a journey of governance and my executive leadership of the organisation. So I think it felt more like a combined effort.
And so with that, in thinking of the organisational strategy, then, is it now you feel it's a genuine shared strategy?
Yes, and I think that particularly in the last few years, particularly post 2020, their partnership is huge. And I think it's led to more committees being developed, greater participation by those board members, greater ownership by them of what that strategy looks like. And, when, for example, we developed both the vision for the organisation and when did we develop what was called an Oasis entitlement, these are the areas that we want to cover. I think all board members feel very confident now to say, actually, no, I'd like you to, hands off, eyes on, but actually ask those challenging questions to unpick the strategy and improve it. And I've actually been much more willing to listen, which is a dreadful thing to admit, but that's very much, it's very true.
So what have you learned? What are your reflections as you're about to switch tack a little bit in your career, John? What do you think are the really important habits that makes a successful leader?
I've really tried hard. I think when you are leading an organisation, everybody's looking to you to role model what you expect from other people. And so over the last few years, I've talked about 4 main principles, and every time you say this, you always forget one of them. So hopefully, I'll remember the ones I was going to share. I think the first thing for me is be absolutely honest with people, and be candid, and be direct, and have that moral directness that if things aren't improving, you have to be the person who calls that out, and you have to, with integrity, because children in our communities, on average, they're 50% free school meal communities. In some of our communities, up to 73%. These children's parents have never been in employment, and that sounds, almost unbelievable for some people, but very high, very, very high levels of challenge. So be honest, be morally direct. I think the second thing, because of the mistakes I've made, is don't make assumptions. When you make assumptions rather than knowing the facts, they're absolutely key. And when you lead to assumptions, it can cause a lot of confusion, distrust. Check your facts, don't make assumptions. I think the third thing is that you can't take things personally. You have to be absolutely clear that you are the leader. Everyone will have an opinion of what you're doing, but it's about how you build a team approach and how you involve people in that vision. And I think the fourth thing, and it goes back to that bit about emotional sort of vulnerability, just do your best. And actually you can, I think, break down a lot of divides by just being really clear, saying, look, I've done my best on this. Help me out if we can improve it. And I think that gets people on the journey along with you, if that's helpful.
Thanks, John. And sticking with the moving on, because I suspect you're probably in planning and reflective mode. If perhaps a way to ask this, as you move on from ACES, what's the growing edge for you personally as a leader these days?
The what, sorry?
The growing edge for you as a leader these days, your development areas.
Oh, what a great question. I think particularly going through the counselling, and particularly with some of the successes we've had in Oasis, we took on 82% of our schools were in failing status when they joined us, and we're growing to 55 this September. We've got currently 87% of them good or better. So it's 45 schools have gone to good and better. You look back at that and you look back at the ingredients of that and you say, well, what got you there? And I think the bit that's got us there was really understanding the reality, the vision, the strategy, and then trying to get the outcomes. But I think it's given me a confidence to that when I'm now mentoring CEOs in the UK, which I'm doing, what are the rapid learning that we've taken on board? And I developed with both Sir Steve Lancashire and with Sir David Carter, the 9 steps of school improvement, and being very systematic about school improvement. And I think it's given me a confidence that I can go and hopefully help other organisations in the same way. But by also honestly sharing the mistakes you make and making sure that they are not jumping into activity, but they're stepping back and they're looking at what the reality of their organisation is. But one of the things I've really learned, Nick, is that you can be a great school leader. That doesn't mean that you're a great CEO. And the role of being a CEO, school leaders become CEOs because they're successful at running schools. But when you become, and the ecosystem of school life has changed, hasn't it, massively in the last 10, 15 years. When you become a CEO, you're becoming a leader of an organisation. So what do the people and processes look like? What does the culture look like? What are you doing? How are you communicating? What sort of CEO do you want to be? How active are you going to be? What does your leadership structure and style look like? How is it anchored on a great scheme of delegation where people understand their accountabilities and roles and responsibilities? And I think it demands a different skill set. And I'm really interested in working with CST. I'm really interested in working with a whole range of CEOs, which I'm going to be doing. But also I'm going to be stepping abroad, working in Abu Dhabi, because they have a very high rate of failure in their state school system. And I'm working with the government there in terms of advising the education minister there as well. So a whole portfolio, and I've been recently asked to go up to be the chair of the education investment area in Blackpool, which I'm interested in looking at because that's a huge challenge, particularly around disadvantaged outcomes and closing the gap. So a whole portfolio of work, but I'll be learning by the mistakes I've made, Nick, if that's a very honest answer.
It sounds like you're going to be as busy and dealing with sort of much complexity as you currently are at Oasis. And on that, I was going to ask in terms of, I can imagine it'd be very easy to not have any time to think in the sort of roles that you've had. So I was curious as how do you make time to think in the roles and the pressures that you have, John?
It depends on how you organise your week, and it's one of the first things I talk to CEOs about. What's the CEO do you want to be? And everybody's obviously out there. I'll use the analogy again, giving air to all of their head teachers and being there to supporting, but you can't inspect your own work. So I think giving yourself, as a CEO, giving yourself space between meetings. I know it's an obvious point, but people don't do it. Giving yourself strategy time each week where you step back and look at the work, making sure there's a really clear strategic plan underpinning everything you're doing. And you're keeping, the way I have run line management in the past is line management is there to focus on both the personal and professional development of the colleague, but the personal development is giving them time for them to raise issues with you. But the professional development is keeping them to account for the plans that they're supposed to be putting in place and the strands across the strategic plan. So I think it's just making sure time is massive, and that whole adage of pause when a really difficult decision comes in, because sometimes, particularly as a CEO, the decisions you make in the moments of time can come back in a tribunal, can come back in a different way, or a parental complaint, what it may be. So your decision making has to be spot on, and making time around those decisions is key.
And so when you've carved out that time to think, what sort of questions would you talked about that strategic role that you like, what sort of questions would you be asking yourself when you found those moments to think?
Well, I think it goes back. I'd say, for example, I'm flying out tomorrow to Abu Dhabi, and in that they've asked me to really focus on teacher development. What's the reality there? What do people need? And I think sometimes you can jump in on the last idea, but actually instead say to yourself, actually, what do those teachers need? What's the reality for them? If I'm working with a CEO in the UK, what's their real reality? And I think it's having that very honest dialogue right at the beginning. Is how does it feel for you? How is it working with your chair? What's the culture like in your schools? So as part of the program in CST, we are making sure as mentors that we visit the CEO schools. And so you can have this great vision, but unless it's really coming through within the school and having fidelity to that vision, it's not worth being part of one of those multi-academy trusts. We've got to really think about what are we trying to achieve.
There's loads of quotes that do the rounds in leadership. One I bumped into, again, not that long ago, was a leader is a dealer in hope. Does that resonate with you?
100%. Yeah, I think if you can't work forward without a sense of hope, your work becomes pointless. I do think if you want to quote back, I think it first starts off to let himself be true. So in other words, where are you now? Then where do you want to get to? And understanding that roadmap of development for an organisation. But I think the stakeholders, how people feel about being part of an organisation, is so important. You can see internationally that's why Apple is so successful, because they're about how people feel about the products, etc. I think getting that sense of hope is absolutely key, and sometimes understanding, I think, what's the point of education. And for me personally, the point of education is we are society builders. An educationist for me is a society builder. An educationist for me is building, or the purpose of education is building a better society where people are critical thinkers, where people have integrity, where people are thinking about the contribution they're making to their communities, and not what they can get from them, but what they contribute to them.
We haven't got too much longer left, but so I do have a few more areas would be great to explore. But thinking particularly as, again, you're moving on to these new roles. Just to ask you, for you, what's the mission that connects your leadership roles through your career?
Their sense of lack of justice in the system, I feel deeply and passionately about the disadvantage gap. I am not a great believer. I'll say it more firmly. I think there is an unequal playing field in the education system between independent education. So 7% of students still go to independent schools and make up 42% of the influential sector. And I think there is a system divide. I would love there to be in a situation in the UK where there is comprehensive education and parents, all parents, whoever they are, were then really valued their school leaders, their schools. And I think we would see a transformation in the British education system because of that. I feel deeply that when we don't get an integrated community and society, because there isn't that integration at school, and those school environments should be an opportunity to bind together all the different classes. There should be an opportunity for us to understand children with profound special needs and support each other. And I think we'd end up with a better society with a less divided education system. And I see education as a right. But I think the way in which private education or religious education or segregated education, I just think it all leads to divides. And I'm passionate about, closing the gap, but actually raising the, attainment for all children.
I'm curious, do you think, I mean, everyone talks a good game about the importance of education, but do you think as a country we value and see its potential, its transformational potential enough?
I think it depends on how you talk about education. Education is about making sure that children have the chance and opportunity to flourish. And I'm not just talking about academically. I'm talking in terms of their attitudes, their behaviours, the skills they're able to apply, thinking about the level of confidence they may have in terms of approaching a situation, the social skills they develop. And what you find in schools is there's a tremendous focus, as you can appreciate, on fractions. Everyone would know how to teach fractions in a school. But when you're then asking teachers through the teacher training to develop very specific social skills, they're not taught as clearly, about how to get a child in a place where they are developing social skills in a really sort of logical way. And both of those are about a young person flourishing. So we've used the word an oasis. They're now using it, I can see in CST as well. We want children to be, it's about human development education. It's not just about the best that's been thought and said. It's not about getting children just ready for the economy. And it's not just about social action. I think it's about human development and understanding education in those terms. And at the moment, of course, it's measured down to the smallest denomination. The smallest denomination of that might be GCSEs. Destination data, I think, is massively important, but underplayed.
Thank you. So our time's nearly up, as I said a moment ago. I wanted to ask you, what would you say brings you, say, 80% of your joy as a leader, John?
Two things, I would say. Oh, I can't. It's 80%, so that doesn't work out, does it? Sorry.
Go with two.
I'll give two examples. Seeing a leader flourish. I've worked with some remarkable principals in Oasis, and seeing them flourish and seeing schools flourish is hugely rewarding, and it brings utter joy. And as part of that, I think seeing some children, for example, who wouldn't survive in the schools and system elsewhere survive in Oasis and flourish and seeing many of those children through their families over time has been a real joy.
Thank you. And the final question for me, thinking forward, and I know you're just about to embark on an exciting new chapter, but thinking of the legacy that you'd like to leave behind from your leadership, what would that be?
I think I did my best, and I enabled others, and I served the organisation to the best of my capacity. But I think that great leaders leave organisations in a great place. And I think Oasis has got a great, there's a very clear strategic plan. It's got a great vision. And I hope our leaders feel really enabled to take the organisation forward. So yeah, I've done my best and I've served the organisation well.
Thanks, John, and thank you for joining me today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our discussion, and I do hope our listeners have as well. And I look forward to you joining us on the next in our series of Ed Influence podcasts.
Fantastic.